Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome to the Korg Wavestation tutorial. In this tutorial series, we're going to examine in depth the plug-in version of the Korg Wavestation. Now, this synthesizer was originally released in 1990, and after a decade of development of digital synthesizers, the Korg Wavestation really represented a quantum leap in the complexity of the sounds that they were capable of generating. Now, in fairness, it wasn't the first digital synthesizer to do any particular thing. What it did do, however, was take various concepts that had already been introduced and significantly expanded them. For instance, there was a principle called vector synthesis that had been implemented in the sequential circuits Prophet VS a few years earlier, and this allowed you to morph between various different waveforms using a joystick. Over on the left-hand side of the Wavestation, you can see a vector joystick very similar to the Prophet VS, and that's no coincidence because many of the design team who were responsible for the Prophet VS, including Dave Smith, the lead engineer, moved to Korg with the collapse of sequential circuits at the end of the 1980s. So this is really a direct successor to the Prophet VS, even though it had been developed by a different company. Today we're going to have an overview of the Korg Wavestation and have a look at its sound hierarchy. Now, it's fair to say that the Wavestation is one of the more complex digital synthesizers to understand. The way that the sounds are comprised with effectively building blocks over multiple levels can be a little bit intimidating to get your head around. I'm going to try to make it as simple as I possibly can, and to that extent today is going to be an overview where we're going to have a nice high level look at these building blocks and try to figure out how sounds are constructed. When you first load the Korg Wavestation, you're probably going to get this thing called Ski Jam. I'll play a key on the keyboard. That's what Ski Jam sounds like. If you load up your Wavestation, you'll have that sound. That sound is made up of many elements. This is called a performance. The performance is the highest level sound block in Wavestation. Now, being a pretty faithful emulation of the original hardware, the Wavestation hierarchy is laid out in memory cards. What we're looking at here is RAM card, random access memory. So this is basically a writable memory card. And Ski Jam is the first entry in a list of 50 performances. If we jump over to RAM 2, you'll see a new list of 50 performances appear. If you single click any item in that list, I've just loaded a new performance. That's the Rain Shifts performance. Let's head back over to RAM 1 and reselect the Ski Jam performance. And before we go any further with having a look at how that sound's constructed, let's just have a quick look at the interface. So on the left-hand side, we have the vector joypad. This basically allows us to morph dynamically between various different sound components. And we haven't had a look at what those components are, so this isn't going to make very much sense at the moment. But if I move this joystick over to the left-hand side, we're going to accentuate that sequence-based sound. If I move it to the right, however, a completely different sound. If I control click in the joystick, I set it back to the center. And we get the balance of these various different sounds that have been merged together to make one. The original Wavestation, depending on which model you bought in its evolution, had up to 11 memory cards. The first 3 were writable, and they're the RAM slots 1, 2, and 3. And then we had 8 read-only memory cards, in this case labeled ROM 4 to 11. With subsequent software releases of this synthesizer, we've had new cards added on, and as we cycle through them, you can see loads of different performances to play with. Got a very important set of options on the top toolbar, and we'll be using those a lot during this tutorial series. But the main one that we need to understand pretty much immediately is the difference between the browser function, which is what you're seeing at the moment, and the edit function. Now that I've clicked the edit button, have a quick look at how the Ski Jam performance is constructed. We have up to 8 separate sound modules called parts that you can combine together to make a single performance. So here we have the part list 1 to 8, and the Ski Jam performance uses 6 parts. While we're here, I'm going to use this as an opportunity to talk about the solo and mute functions. Now, the user interface here is pretty poor because can you see the 5 parts that aren't currently highlighted? They have a dark grey on black loudspeaker symbol, and it's basically impossible for me to see them because my camera's backlit. but I can just about make out the loudspeaker symbol with these two lines. Those two wavy lines representing, sound being emitted from the loudspeaker are telling you that you can currently hear every one of those 6 parts. If I single click on the loudspeaker icon, however, I've just soloed part number 1. So if I press a key, now we're only hearing part number 1. Now I'm going to choose part number 2. You can click anywhere in this row, but I generally click the patch name. So let's have a look at part number 2. And now you can see that part number 2 is currently muted. Simply selecting that item from the list doesn't unmute it. Part number 1 is still soloed. If I want to hear part number 2, I need to click the loudspeaker icon. And now this has been soloed and everything else has been muted. Can you just about see part number 1 is now mute? Now if I press the same key, C2, you're not going to hear this sound because we have the ability to key split parts, and the key zones image below tells you how we do that. So I'm going to have to press a C4 all the way up here to hear that particular sound. And can you hear that that's hard panned to the left hand side? If we select part number 3 and solo that, there's the right hand equivalent. So how do we hear left and right minis simultaneously without hearing any of the other parts? Well, we can do that because you can unmute individual sounds. The way that you need to do this, and there's no indication in the user interface, this is what you have to do. You press the Control key on your keyboard. And now if I select the loudspeaker symbol for part number 2, can you see that that loudspeaker sound symbol has now been brought back? There's the left and right of that. It's probably a Mini Moog emulation. That's what Mini is standing for. Let's head down to part number 4. Now I just want to solo Spectrum 2, so I can click on the loudspeaker. Everything else has just been muted. Select double pad and then solo it. I don't need to select the part. I'm just doing this so that it's really easy to see those loudspeaker symbols. There's the double pad. Now I had to press that key quite quietly. If I hit it too hard, you won't hear it because we've got some velocity layering. We'll worry about all of this detail much later. Finally, just to finish the story, let's have a look at part number 6. There's that sound. Deactivate solo, bring all of the other sounds back in. And you're not hearing the Mini Moog at the moment because that sound only happens all the way up there. Getting used to the solo and muting facility in this synthesizer is absolutely critical, because even though we're looking at the parts in the context of a performance, this functionality exists elsewhere at lower levels as well. So you really need to kind of get to grips with, I'm single clicking in this loudspeaker and it kind of initially doesn't look like there's anything happening, but if you look very, very carefully in the dark grey on black behind the scenes, it is actually soloing and unsoloing the part as we go. Okay, let's jump back up to the browser. Now I'm going to throw away the complexity of a multi-part sound because that's just too much to handle at the moment. I'm going to load a sound that only uses a single part, and I've chosen performance number 6, Cascade Falls. So I simply single click on that performance. You don't have to double click. Let's have a quick listen to the sound. That's Cascade Falls. If I hold that key down long enough, we get a sequence playing, so we know there's some pretty complex stuff going on here, but it's all in the context of a single part. At this point, I think it's helpful to bring in a screenshot from the user manual. So here's our performance. We've just loaded Cascade Falls. That's the name of the performance. We have a single part in this performance, and here it is. In the Ski Jam performance that we had earlier, we had 5 other parts as well. As you can see here, a part is further subdivided, and the most important bit is the patch. This is where the sound is stored. It's also where we're going to be able to create some of that zoning that we just saw when we were having a look at Ski Jam. And we've got this component as well called part detail. Let's jump back to the synth and figure out how a patch works and what these details are all about. So here, everything that I'm circling with the mouse is your part. When you first head over into the Edit tab, you're editing the performance, which means that you have an overview of the part, including the patch, the underlying sound source that's stored inside this part. Now, the performance, called Cascade Falls, happens to share the same name as the underlying patch. For fairly obvious reasons, this is obviously inherited from the patch name, but I could call this performance anything I wanted, and it has no impact or bearing on the sound underneath. This is also where we're able to edit the part information. Remember, a part is the thing that's stored inside a performance, and here are all of the details and zones. In the next episode, we'll break down each one of these components and have a look at them all. So that's your overall view of the Cascade Falls patch and how that patch is configured inside the part, which then lives inside the performance. When we click the patch edit button, however, this is where things really kick off. This screen suddenly got a lot more complex and there's an awful lot of information here, and we'll need to spend an entire episode breaking down exactly how a patch works. Because today we're just worried about an overview of the whole synth, let's just have a very quick look at how a patch is constructed. So what you're looking at here is an example of a patch. It contains an oscillator, a thing that makes sound. That sound can be filtered and amplified. All sorts of various different modulation components can be applied to it. Once that sound's been constructed, it can be sent to a left-right panner and then ultimately off to the outside world. But a patch is actually more than this, because one single patch can contain up to 4 different oscillators. Here's our Cascade Falls patch. Quick reminder of the overall sound. So at the moment you're hearing 4 oscillators all being mixed together to make that single output sound, the Cascade Falls patch. Let's solo the first of those 4 oscillators. We can use the same principle, simply single click on the loudspeaker. All of the other oscillators have now been muted. And if I hold it for long enough, you can hear that the sound is changing over time. The clue as to what's going on is this little asterisk symbol, because oscillator A is a wave sequence, and it's a headline feature of the synthesizer itself. Look at its name, Advanced Vector Synthesis, that's the thing with the joystick, wave sequencing. These words are really important. It's going to take us an entire video to actually fully discuss how wave sequencing works, but suffice to say that if you're currently looking at a wave sequence oscillator, the wave sequence button is enabled, and we can dive into it and actually edit the wave sequence itself. Basically what you're looking at here is multiple different sounds that are played one after the other in this kind of sequential manner. Each one of those sounds is called a waveform. So an oscillator is actually constructed from one or more waveforms. This list that you see in the browser with the wave name lists all the various waveforms that are used to construct this single oscillator. The oscillator is then one of 4 oscillators that combine together to make the patch. That's a lot to follow. Let's simplify things down a little bit by selecting oscillator number 2 and solo it instead. There's my electric piano waveform. Now this really is a simple waveform that contains an electric piano sample. If you're looking at a simple waveform, the wave sequencing button is disabled. Oscillator number 3, let's solo it, contains an Airvox waveform. It's a bit quiet, this one. It's a bit quiet because its level has been set to 30, so each one of these oscillators has been mixed together to make the single overall output sound. The 4th oscillator, oscillator D, has something else a little bit unusual about it. I'm going to press the key now, and there was a delay before that sound kicked in. This patch has been constructed such that all 4 oscillators don't start sounding immediately. Oscillator D, or oscillator 4, has a delay. So if I bring all of the oscillators back in, so I clicked on the loudspeaker symbol then, you're going to hear all 4 of these oscillators simultaneously. Here's my key press. And then you hear that 4th oscillator be introduced after that time delay. Let's have a quick look at how these waveforms are stored. I'm going to jump back up to oscillator B and solo it. Let's overwrite that waveform with a different waveform. I'm going to click the list button, which is going to bring up a list of all of the waveforms available to me. Now it's pre-selected waveform number 39, which is E-piano 3, and you can see here's its waveform number. Let's scroll right back to the beginning of the list to get a better understanding of how each memory card is constructed. So we're just looking at ROM 11 here. The first 32 waveforms are actually wave sequencers. Every one of them has an asterisk in front of the name. And if I select one of these waveforms and hold my mouse down, you'll get a preview of that sound. If I want to load this wave sequence into slot B of my patch, I just click OK, or I can double click on the sound. And now that sound's been written into the patch. And there it is. Click my solo button. And now I'll hear all of the other sounds in that patch at the same time. Let's re-engage solo, head back into the list again. After entry number 32, we get a list of simple waveforms, and they're the same across all of the 11 standard memory cards. So basically the synthesizer as it came out of the factory, regardless of which RAM card or ROM module you were using, you get the same list of waveforms. So if I scroll forwards a little bit, start at 68, we go from Gendar down to Birdland. If I select a different ROM card and go over to the same waveform range, you can see that the waveforms are the same across all of these cards. So you have this stock of, I think it's 484 separate waveforms from number 32 up to 515. So those are your basic building blocks of sound. Let's overwrite this wave sequence with Digital 1. I just double clicked on the sound then. That sound's now been written into the patch. You don't have to have 4 oscillators for a single patch. If we click this structure option, we can cycle between 1, 2, and 4. So those are your options. You can have a simple single waveform in a single patch of a single part, and that's the simplest sound block that you can have. Now the Wavestation by default doesn't have such a thing. When you first load up the instrument, you have this really complex sound ski jam with all of these various different oscillators bundled into patches, patches bundled into parts. I don't think that's a very useful first step when you load this instrument. So I decided it would be nice to have a really simple, clean performance that contains the absolute minimum amount of sound. And so I built myself an initialized preset. I'm going to click the file button here and then load my default RAM bank. So I'm going to say load all RAMs. So this is basically going to overwrite the default options that come with the Wavestation out of the box with my slightly edited ones. So I select my default bank and say open. And now performance 0 has been overwritten. I don't have ski jam in my standard default template. I have this preset called template. If we edit this performance, you'll see it's as simple as I can possibly make it. It's an absolutely basic organ sound. So what I've done there is I've basically gone through every setting in the synthesizer, everywhere I can find, setting everything I can find down to the simplest possible value. So I have a single part here, and when we go into the patch is a 1 oscillator patch containing a single waveform. There's nothing complex about it at all. All of the various other options that we'll have a look at in later videos, they've all been set to the simplest possible default. Now occasionally I like to offer little perks to my YouTube channel members and patrons. I'll be sharing this default preset with my channel members with a set of instructions on how to configure this stuff. If you're interested in becoming a patron or channel member, check out the links below. It's an awesome way to help support my channel. And with that said, that's the overview finished. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please hit like if you did. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'll see you for the next episode. Thanks very much.